Welcome to Making Tracks. My name's Thomas Cam Meadley, and this is a podcast where I'm going to be speaking to musicians about their musical and personal journeys and the story behind one of their own songs. I'm really glad you can join me today. This is Making Tracks. Today I'm joined by Dizraeli, a poet, producer, MC and multi-instrumentalist, recently moved to Bristol, recently based in Bristol, and one of the things we're going to be talking about today is your recent album, The Unmaster. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, man. The Unmaster is a kind of like an oral, it kind of like a sonic film. It's very London centric. So I wrote it when I was still based in London. It's about madness and collapse, and how we navigate through madness and collapse, both in the world around us and in the world inside us. And so yeah, that's the Unmaster, and it's really made musically. It's really made out of the sounds of London. Most of the instruments on the album, other than the drums and the synth bass, are made out of recorded sounds around my area where I was living in London. So the ventilator in the kebab shop behind my house, the creaking of the hinge of a gate. The sound of a bollard outside Halfords.
So it's got a real sense of place.
It's very, very that, yeah. And all the music I make has that, I think. It's always really important to me for music to have a sense of context and just like be unapologetically covered in the surface noise of the place it comes from. So all my albums have been that, really, and this is definitely, if any of my albums is a London album, then this is.
One of the interesting things that stood out for me was about you spending time in Senegal, learning about drumming, and talking there about the blend between culture and music and place. I'm interested to see, firstly, why you did that, and then how that's played into your music.
I went to Senegal because I've always loved percussion, and I've always been a drummer and percussionist. Never really a trained drummer and percussionist, but it's always been a consistent part of what I play and how I build my tracks is by basing it around the drums, and always live. And Senegal really is just... And a lot of those West African countries, that whole kind of cluster of countries in West Africa, the Gambia, Senegal, Guinea-Conakry, Nigeria, Ghana, all of those countries are just really a cradle of percussive innovation and talent and amazing composition based on rhythm, and
it's such a kind of ancient culture, and would you say, like, it's kind of really part of that history as well, that it's kind of talking about being infused with a place? Did you get the sense that there was perhaps this relationship where the music was infused with the place, and perhaps that the sense of place was influenced the music?
Yeah, man. Well, I think that's probably true of any music from any point in history and any culture, really. So, the jungle and drum and bass music that I grew up with in Bristol was really heavily infused with sense of place. It's like the industrial sounds of the city, the influence of Caribbean culture, which obviously, jungle and drum and bass came out of the encounter of like electronic dance music and Caribbean culture and sound system culture, and so I think every form of music is really full of place, or every form of music that I love, definitely, when it really feels like it comes from where it comes from, and it sounds like it comes from where it comes from. And the music of Senegal is definitely no exception to that.
I think it's amazing that there's this, you can kind of trace this narrative of history through music.
For
I think
sure.
That's
And
really
and that
interesting.
I think though, one of the things that's always fascinated me about West African percussion based music is that so much of what I have grown up with and have grown up like studying and loving, whether jungle drum and bass, garage music, hip hop, so much of that you can trace, like grime music, so much of it you can trace back to West Africa, and obviously the story with that is about exploitation and colonialism and slavery, and how the West African cultures traveled initially to European dominated countries, is a huge story of exploitation and genocide. But it's just looking back to West Africa, looking back to Senegal and the Gambia and Ghana and those countries, is so exciting to me to see where all these rhythms that I grew up dancing to originally came from, and to see how sort of strongly they've carried through.
Yeah. It's such a complex history as well. It's interesting to kind of to compare that, I guess the source of that, but then to see how that history has, I don't know, infused and changed the music. And obviously, there's a lot of discussions now about music, about Black Lives Matter and these kind of things. And there has always been this sense, I feel, that in that history, that music has been a powerful way of surviving difficulty. And I don't think that's unique to this kind of cultural area, but I do think that there's something about music that gives us the ability to, I think, come together as a community and feel that resilience, And it's certainly something I felt with the music I'm currently working on is based on the time that I spent with leukemia. Yeah. And I felt that during that time, when I spent a long time in isolation, that listening to music was something that made me feel connected, and then actually making music made me feel part of something. And of course, and there's a lot of parallels there in terms of into your own experience. So I'm wondering, kind of, at the time when you were really struggling, did music play a role in that experience?
Yeah, man, it was interesting, I guess, because as you say, this album in particular came out of a time of struggling mentally. I found that actually in the time of worst sort of struggle and wobble and self-doubt and darkness, I wasn't really capable of making much at all. I had really kind of frozen up artist block for a long time. But what I did do is I wrote a diary really consistently. And I also did a practice called morning pages, which is a free association writing. And so when I came out of that period of feeling really shit, I could look back and read what it was like. And it was those writings that became the lyrics to the album. And musically, actually, the music of the album was really born out of that moment of the energy that I felt when the pendulum swung back the other way, and I suddenly felt alive again, Yeah, and it's interesting. I think that there's a lot of really... there's a lot of uplift and humor in the music of this album, because it came out of like the kind of release after a darkness, and then the lyrics are more from the period of darkness itself. So it's a bit of a collision of those two states in a way.
Could you tell us a little bit more about this current song that we're about to play in a moment, how that kind of plays into what we've been talking about?
Yeah, this song is called Everybody Here's Golden, and it is really, I guess it is, lyrically, it's the moment of coming out of what feels like a long winter or a long darkness, and opening the window and being able to feel the air on your face and see the light in the garden. One of the things that characterizes lower psychological states of being for me personally is that I'm less able to be present to myself and to the world around me. And Everybody Here's Golden is kind of an explosion of presence and noticing after a long winter of being kind of cocooned in your cave, your dark, sweaty, smelly cave, psychologically. Actually, it was more Everybody Here's Golden. The moment that it described is actually took place in the winter, and it was actually a bright, sunny, cold day in December when I kind of came out of this cocoon that I'd been in. So even though the feel I think is quite sunny, the day itself was a cold day. But it's that feeling of release. It's that feeling of release.
Unfortunately, due to YouTube's copyright laws, I can't play the full track here, but there is a link to the YouTube video of this song in the description. If you'd like to listen to the full podcast uninterrupted in the future, you can find it on the website or on all major platforms, including Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, etc. And those links are also all in the description. Hopefully, you've now had a chance to listen to the song, so let's head on back to the conversation. Yes, wonderful.
Thanks, man.
The thing that really struck me, particularly that kind of rousing end, is this idea of kind of, I think, permission that you can do that. And, I think often, when you're in that dark place, it feels like, that your options are kind of limited, and that perhaps this kind of weight of the ego, as we talked about, is kind of hemming you in. And I love that idea of realizing that you have that freedom to just do these things, Yeah,
man. Realizing that you have working arms and legs, and that you're blessed with a brain and lungs, and you can go out and, obviously not saying that people who do not have working arms and legs cannot go out and do.
Yeah, but I mean, it is that feeling of liberation and freedom, and I think, the words that comes to mind is ecstasy, because it literally means X outside of stasis, which can mean the body, or it can mean a state of being still, and that often in this case would mean you're in the state of stasis, being stuck. But then this is representing that moment of coming outside of oneself and being able to be able to come out of that state.
That's lovely, man. Yeah, ecstasy. Yeah, eccentric in ecstasy.
I've never thought of eccentric before. That's really interesting. Outside of the center, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. When I first got to know Kate Tempest, she used to call herself Eccentric Tempest. That was her name. I always really liked that, being eccentric, outside of the middle. Yeah. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And the other thing which I noticed was that there's a lot of kind of quite in-depth description about individuals and characters, and perhaps that a part of this is to feel that your focus is no longer on yourself, and you're able to observe these characters outside of yourself.
Yeah, I guess so, man. I think it's partly just become quite a sort of central part of how I work as an artist, is just to watch and copy, really. One of the things that I've realized over time is that the world around me is so rich in detail and strangeness that actually to create, you don't really need to create at all. you can just open the window and stick your head out and observe and write down what you see. And obviously that what you see will be written down through the lens of everything that you've absorbed before and everything you've practiced and learnt how to do. But I think, the idea of being... I really believe in the creative process as being a thing of channeling rather than a thing of making from nothing.
Absolutely, yeah. And I love the idea of being a lens, and perhaps that, it goes two ways, because you think about light, light being perhaps creative consciousness, that is the energy or whatever that gives us the capacity to understand and also to connect and to have any sense of perception. And I think, for me, I feel very strongly that light is something that kind of dwells within us. And then when we create, that comes out of us, but also that light emerges spontaneously from everyone around us. And I think, in a sense, for me, the interplay of light and color and that kaleidoscopic vision is part of what music allows us to do. And that's kind of the role of whatever interpretive, communicative medium we use. So, yeah, I love that idea. And I'm really interested by what you said about the kind of medium, because obviously you're someone who uses different mediums. And so, yeah, I'm interested in the kind of what you feel is the role between yourself as a lens in different mediums, I suppose.
Yeah, I think just that, really. I think that's really been my mission, or my just direction of the last 5 years in particular. Certainly since I had my little mini meltdown that led to this album, has been just learning to notice, and I hope creating work and musically creating places for people to come in which they can feel that richness of the world around them and the kind of infinite possibilities in themselves, the way that they can also notice and be, it's not even being a conduit, because that suggests being a vessel from one place to another, or we are just a part of this world that's around us at all times, and every square centimetre of it is teeming with detail and poetry. And I think that's my work really, is just to notice that and to write it down, and perhaps in doing that to enable other people to come to notice a bit more,
perhaps
maybe
facilitate that process rather than being a conduit, channeling that energy to give people perhaps the keys to unlock that energy within themselves.
Yeah, man. And also I just really fucking like beats and bass lines, and
doesn't all have to be deep.
and yeah, I love dancing to them, and I love rap. It makes me feel alive and make sense of things, and I think big part of my motive is just that, is to make the music that I want to hear, on a selfish level. And that's so it's just a big collision of all the wicked novels and poetry that I've read, and Nas and Shakespeare and Getz, and
I'm interested in terms of your relationship with poetry and rapping. Were those two things that came together, or were there different stages? Do you feel that they're in a way separate?
No, they're not separate at all. I guess they probably came at a pretty similar time. I mean, I grew up in a household with a lot of books in. Both my parents were teachers, and my mum was an English teacher, English and drama, and there was a lot of literature in the house. So, and I really grew up with that everywhere. It was very normal for me to have books around, and for mum to be quoting Shakespeare, and So that was part of the picture from a really, really early point. But then I got into hip hop really early on, at the age of about 9. So yeah, I would have been 9. And as soon as I heard that, because I was also passionate about music from a really early age, when I heard the collision of poetry and music, and the fact that there was such a clear presence of like swagger and cool, and the kind of like flashy, flamboyant machismo that I wanted for myself. So yeah, it's so I sort of learned as soon as I heard my first rap tune, which was Boom Shake the Room by Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. I started to write, I learned the lyrics to that, and then I started to write my own raps. And I was already at that point writing little limericks and funny little poems, and I've always had a soft spot for like daft rhyming poetry, Edward Lear, you know. But then, you know, there'd be Dylan Thomas getting quoted in the house as well, so that was always a present thing too. And so yeah, it's always merged, man. And I never really saw. I think I was lucky to have friends that introduced me to hip hop music where there was such a clear love of poetics and the kind of flexibility and power of language. And I think for me, they've always just been the same expressions of the same thing. And it was always surprising to me early on when I got called a poet, when I started doing poetry slams, and because to me I was just doing rap but without the music behind it. And people, I think the distinction between poetry and rap can sometimes be a classist thing, it can sometimes be a racist thing. Like my friend Vanessa Kasule posted a poem recently in response to Colston coming down in Bristol, and it was a really thoughtful, delivered in a really measured kind of way, you know, and it didn't rhyme. It was, you know, beautifully crafted bit of free poetry, and someone commented under her post on Twitter, "This isn't even good, it's just angry rap." And I was like, the only reason you're saying that is because she's black. And there's a way that people receive literature that is in the form of hip hop or grime spoken by a black person. The way that white people receive that, who are not used to that kind of medium, that makes them push it away. And it's not the way it's given and delivered and conceived, it's the way it's received.
It's the way it's received.
And it's very interesting to me that as a middle class white person, I have very often been called a poet, even though I'm doing 16 bar verses of multi-syllabic rhymed rap. It's like you couldn't be more rap than that. Very often I'll have people come up to me that are like, "Oh, I didn't think I even liked hip hop, but that's really that was really poetry, wasn't it? I wouldn't even call that rap." Like, well, you wouldn't even call it rap because you can receive it in a way that's agreeable to you. So there's a lot of stuff bound up with how people define rap versus poetry, I think. And rap has become sometimes like a byword for the academy and the kind of the white dominated system of classification. It's become a way for people to dismiss poetry. And I think that's fucked up.
And it comes back to this link between perhaps exploitation in music that we discussed, you know, with the history of black music and things like that. So yeah, no, it's really interesting to kind of draw that parallel. And perhaps there's this parallel, we talked about the lens of, you know, as an interpretive lens, there is perhaps this dirt, or there's this kind of accumulated thing which prevents us from actually perceiving things as they are and as perhaps they're expressed.
Yeah, I mean, we're never going to perceive things as they are we? We're story machines, but we can definitely work on the consensus stories that we tell collectively, to at least see a bit clearer.
I love that phrase, story machines. I think that's a beautiful way of describing us. And I'm very interested in myth myself, and myth being something which is our kind of collective way of trying to understand the world. And one thing that I've come across is there's a link between your music and folk music. And I was interested in, how that plays in, again, ancient culture, mythology, and folk music being one of the oldest surviving traditions of music. How has that come into your music?
I mean, I take folk music to mean just music of the people, and not necessarily from like folkloric traditions. But for me, I think we were talking about music having a sense of place, and for me as a artist, it's always been really important for me to have a sense of place and history, and not try and make music and write in a way that claims anything that I haven't lived. And I think there was a point when I was starting to look at my cultural heritage as a white British person, and I was looking for what were the forms of, because I grew up listening to hip hop and drum and bass and reggae music, and but yeah, particularly hip hop and drum and bass were my two kind of go-to forms, really. And I can't remember what it was that I heard. I think I heard some sea shanties. My brother went and worked on a barge for a summer when he was 15, 16. And it was one of these kind of tourist barges, a kind of refurbished barge. And with the crew, they were always singing sea shanties. And he came back from that summer job singing sea shanties. And I was just really struck by how sort of similar it was in like feel to a lot of the hip hop music that I loved. And I started looking into sea shanties and just found this whole wealth of folk music that was, very simple accompaniment, like a single instrument accompanying a single voice, and the voice telling stories of the people in the accent of the people, the dialect of the people. And all this call and response as well, and use of rhyme. And I was like, wow, it's such a clear link to me between the hip hop music that I've always loved and this folk music. So it's interesting. So I didn't really grow up around folk music other than hearing Scottish folk music in connection with my I have a Scottish side of the family. So at family birthdays and weddings and stuff, there would be Scottish music. My cousin played the bagpipes, so there was some of that. But I was really interested to hear English folk music, and so I started, and the ballads and stuff like that. The way the ballads, for people that don't know, I'm sure you do, Thomas, but for people that don't know, the ballads were songs that were written to act as newspapers, basically. They were written to tell stories that had taken place in, the story of a murder and an execution that took place in London would be transmitted to the villages and in the countryside through the means of ballads, and a
kind of store of information.
Yeah, exactly. And it was literally stories told through rhyme and song that travelling minstrels would take to the villages, and they'd be paid to sing the news, and that is, to me, what hip hop is. It's people telling stories that wouldn't otherwise be told. So yeah, that was the connection for me. So I spent a while looking into folk music and going to a lot of folk events and meeting folk artists and collaborating with folk artists as well. And I ended up incorporating a lot of folk into a couple of albums that I did, one solo album and one with the Small Gods, which was a band I was working with. And so there's a lot of folk style. It was almost always original songs that I wrote in the style of folk things that I've been hearing. So it wasn't really like, I wasn't really playing folk music in the respect of playing traditional songs or ballads, or but it was really strongly inspired by that.
Kind of steeped in that tradition, and in a sense that history. And I think, that idea of it being a way of capturing story, and as a store of information, that's why perhaps history and place is so embedded into music, is that it has this capacity to, in a sense, absorb a story, and absorb information and the culture and the history that went into it.
Yeah, man. And the amazing thing with how easy it is to record now is that I can walk down the road with my Zoom field recorder and literally record the sound of what that moment of that day sounds like. And so it's a really kind of direct kind of journalism in a way. And then the way that I try not to write in a journalistic way, because I don't feel like it's my role to be a journalist. I'm not really writing those kind of broadside ballads. I'm writing a very subjective, an odd take on a moment of a day.
One thing that when we spoke earlier was, you talked about being an observer and a student of life, which I thought was such a beautiful idea.
Yeah, that's so important to me, and that's really a lot of what the title of the album is, the Unmaster. And that's about letting go of kingship, letting go of dominion, letting go of needing to be the king of the king of your island, the king of your situation, and relearning how to be a student. So for me, it's related to the Buddhist idea, the Zen Buddhist idea of beginner's mind, coming to every moment with absolute curiosity and freshness. And if we can come to the moments, the string of moments that constitutes our life, then with that freshness and that curiosity, then we can actually be present to our lives rather than trying to control it or run from it or crush it in some way.
And that ecstatic moment that you talk about, coming back to that state of presence is, in a sense, perhaps coming back to that wellspring of life that is, in a sense, that present moment, which is the source of energy and the source of the moment, I think.
Yeah, and it's not even the source, is it? It's just absolutely there, and the richness of, like I keep saying, the richness of every moment that we're alive on the planet is just a glory to behold. And I've lived a lot of my life not there, and rushing down corridors in my mind and imagining and anticipating and fearing and regretting. And it was such a revelation to me to realize that I could return to, or first to realize that I hadn't been there for a long time, and then to realize that I could come back, I could return, I could be a student.
You could wake up from the dream.
I could see, I could look at a beautiful view and see what was there, rather than see the kind of turmoil of my mind, fuzzing it all out all the time. So that's the game now, is to really keep my mindfulness practice going, keep noticing and try and
keep the lens clear.
Keep the lens clear, man, and try and sit in the moments that my life is, and try and maintain that humility as well, which I don't always manage to do. I definitely slip up and get caught up in my in the games of social media and trying to present myself in a certain way, or worrying about how I'm perceived. And so it's a constant swing, man. You one moment you're absolutely plugged into where and who you are and what's happening around you, and the next minute you're spiraling through the same old bullshit that you always were. But it's about learning to come home, keep coming home, you know.
I was watching an explanation of music theory, and talking about, you know, if C is home, then, you know, G is the first step out on the journey, and, you know, A minor is the kind of oh, what's going to happen. And they were saying in terms of jazz, the idea of jazz is you never ever come home, but you always kind of suggest it, and you've just got to keep it close enough to home to kind of keep it cool and unsettling.
Love it. Yeah, that's lovely.
There's a parallel there with journeys and music. You know, we talked about physical journeys and things, but, you know, music is a journey. That the music, that a piece of music has a journey and a sense of rhythm, and I think that works both ways. That, you know, the way we understand music can inform the way we understand our lives and the rhythms of our lives.
Yeah, and vice versa, of course. Yeah. And yeah, that's one of the things I love about music, is it's an experience rather than a kind of frozen. There's nothing frozen or detached about music. Not that I always manage to experience like that, especially as someone that makes music. I'm sure you get the same things. You find yourself analysing and kind of like taking a couple of steps back from the canvas every time you listen to a track and thinking how you would have done it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And that analysis, you know, we talked about this kind of ecstatic moment, and I think for me there's two elements to our interaction with things, is analysis and synthesis. And so analysis is separating out, and we're kind of obsessed with analysis in our society. The idea of you break everything down into its component parts so it's comprehensible, and that's the focus, you know. But for me, the most beautiful thing, particularly about music and the bringing together of lyrics and words and rhythm and the self and other people, is that moment of synthesis, of pure bringing together. Yeah,
absolutely, man. And that just comes back to that thing of being present to ourselves and being present to our actual experience, because that the stories we're telling about our experience is never, you know, is part of how we distance ourselves from our lives, I think. There's a really cool Buddhist concept called the two arrows. Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't.
So the idea is that every experience comes to us as two arrows, and the first arrow is this is more talking about adverse or negative experiences. So the first arrow is the experience itself. So, you know, I break my leg. And the second arrow is the story we tell about the experience. And
the story machines that we as story machines make.
Yeah, and in our culture we're kind of obsessed with the second arrow. It's all about the analysis and the kind of the heady, fearful, kind of fearful storytelling that we do all the time. The data is, I have a meeting tomorrow. You know, the story is, I'm worthless and it will be terrible.
Yeah.
The data is, this person looked at me. The story is, this person hates me. I'm worthless, and you know there is something to be feared. The story is that there's a threat. So it's that thing of these kind of separating out these two arrows and trying to be there for the experience. And obviously, life is full of suffering and difficulty and pain and heartache. But a lot of that is carried in how we respond to life.
Absolutely. And I think that the accumulated experience forms the dirt on the lens, you know, and perhaps the thing of meditation is to accept that actually that dirt or that matter on the lens is kind of necessary, because those stories form our way of understanding the world. But if we don't have ways to let those things go, whether through meditative contemplation, I think also something that's been lost is the idea of confession, of forgiveness. And for me, that isn't just about saying this isn't, I forgive that person. It's about saying, I'm going to let this go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, man. Like allowing yourself. And that's one of the things that I find really useful about meditation, actually, is it's a kind of constant exercise of letting go. My foot hurts. Observe the feeling in my foot. What is it actually? It's composed of a tingle and an ache. What is the ache? Is it a temperature? Is it actually as severe a pain as I think, or is it just an anticipation that something awful is going to happen to me if I don't shuffle in my position, And then if you observe things, if you watch for long enough, then the experience changes. Rather than getting swept up in the idea that something awful is happening to my foot, what happens if I just watch and see, and it's gone,
and you let it go,
and it's you let it go, or it just goes of its own accord. You know what I mean? It's like
I think the moment of letting go is actually the best part of things. And it's funny because in our society, we're kind of, the idea is you accumulate more and more and more. And perhaps, you accumulate more and more stories, you accumulate more and more objects. But the things that feel good is the moment of release,
Yeah.
You have this weekend and then you go and, I've had this really hard week. I go out and I get drunk and, that responsibility is gone. And actually, I think that in a sense, we accumulate these things really to let them go. But we are afraid, perhaps because we don't know what there is beneath, beneath. If we let go of the story, who am I? If I let go of the story, what's going on?
Yeah.
And I think that when you talked about confidence, the word confidence comes from confide, which I think just means with faith, someone who has faith.
Okay.
And it's that faith that beneath the story is something that is positive, that is, you say, healing or kind of liberating.
Yeah, carry on.
Well, I think that faith is the belief that you leap out into the unknown and the universe will catch you. And something that I feel we've lost in our abstract, reductionist, materialist view of the world, the analytical view of the world, is to believe that the bits, the stories the models that we use to interpret the world are the real thing. And we forget, I think, that, as you say, what is that first arrow. It is what it is,
Yeah.
And then we come back to it at some point in time. In a sense, we create that time, and we have to create time for stories. There has to be a narrative. But for me, I think that a story is something that we write onto the page of infinity, and the way we do that actually is through death, in all its forms. And this is something that I'm really interested in myself, is that when I talk about death, I mean finiteness, finitude. There are endings, and I don't think that there actually are endings, but we need to create the approximation or the sense of an ending to give definition to our lives. And that is actually the value of human consciousness, is to say, this is a self, that's not a self, this is the different building blocks and so on. But we can get so caught up in that we lose sight, we lose connection with what is, and we get so wrapped up in the story that we forget that actually where we are is now.
Yeah. And to have faith that there is, to have faith in now, isn't it? It's like, I think we do have quite a lot of fear at being present to our lives. It's like, there's a sense of, if I really look at what's happening, there'll be some darkness and some truth that I don't want to see. Terrible. Do you know what I mean? If I come home to a quiet house, if I turn out the light, what will I see there? And I think that's, so I think it's a massive thing that stops people from looking into themselves.
That there is a darkness within one, the belief, which I think actually is something that's so propagated in our society that the inherently within us is this kind of dark, terrible thing that we have to keep through our civilized natures and the stories we tell, keep hidden and keep,
and just cram it out with noise so you don't have to look at it, cram it out with work and tabs open on your laptop. So
infinite tabs.
And actually that's the joy for me, man, is that actually if you look long enough and quietly enough, what you find in the very center is quiet. It's actually absolute stillness, and it's infinitely spacious. And it's something that I feel like I've glimpsed a couple of times in my life when I've been really keeping up with my meditation practice. Actually, what's at the very center of you and your experience is, absolute peace. And that's quite an incredible thing to realize. It's not turmoil and darkness. It's absolute peace.
I also would say the most important experience of my life has been absolute silence and stillness. And so I had this experience, which exactly is what you're saying. I was told about 2-3 years ago that there was nothing they could do. So after I was diagnosed with leukemia, had a number of treatments, they told me there's nothing we can do. And I went home.
Wow.
Here I am kind of facing death, hearing that ultimate turmoil. Not only is there inside myself this darkness, there is inside myself the knowledge of my impending death. And my response was noise. My response was to get high and to distract myself and blah 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 blah. But then one night I was sat alone in my room and I got this realization and this sense where I was like, if I'm going to die, and that's inevitable and that's an absolute, what is the purpose of my fear? What is the purpose of this distraction? It's not like that's going to change anything. So look, all that's stopping me is that courage to take the leap of faith, that fide, to have that confidence to be like, I'm going to leap in the dark and see what's there. And so I was sat alone in my room, and I would describe it as the experience that I'd had was this turmoil, this boiling turmoil, this darkness deep within myself, like below, and I'm just trying to keep my head above water and not look at it. And then I looked down, and it's kind of like I plunged into the darkness, and I felt like I was falling and drowning and kind of, really descending. And then suddenly there was this moment of sudden absolute peace. Of absolute void and absolute light and stillness, and suddenly it was like all that darkness, that blackness was just gone.
Wow.
All that is just amazing. Just gone.
Wow, man. And you're here 3 years later.
And I'm here. Because then after this experience, after that, I spent a few weeks just in that state of pure presence and innocence, I think, and connection. And I was in that state, and I came to know it so well that I think now the rest of my life since then has been trying to find a way to tune back into that. But about a month or so after this, I got a phone call, and the nurse was like, "Oh, we've just we got the test back from your latest results, and you've just spontaneously just gone into remission. She's gone."
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's been the case ever since.
Yeah.
Wow, man. Wow, what a gift.
Yes, exactly. What a gift.
Yeah, it's mad how these darknesses can be the biggest gifts, right?
Absolutely. And the realization that one is resilient.
Yeah. I mean, my own experience of mental wobble was, nothing to the intensity of what you must have felt. But I definitely look on that period as my biggest teacher by a long way of like humility and just reassessing my priorities and discovering who my actual friends were and
what matters.
Oh man, so many things were learned. And I'm very grateful. It just feels completely unequivocally and uncomplicatedly like a gift.
And that realization that life once life is restored, that life is a gift.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that moment of exploding out of the darkness, or opening the window after the long winter,
emerging out of the cave.
Yeah, man.
And to talk about that, Plato's cave is the idea that most of our lives we spent chained to each other, chained to a rock, watching the flickers of light against a wall. There's these shadows that are what we call reality. And the idea is that through things like meditation and liberation, what you might call enlightenment, is that one can realize the mind-forged manacles, as Blake would call it.
Yeah.
You can release yourself, right? And you step outside and there's this sudden moment, and it can be blinding, which is why we're afraid of it. We're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I don't know what's out there. It's blinding. But if we have the courage to do that, it's just...
Yeah. It's everything, isn't it?
I love the idea kind of that music is a store of information, of stories, of cultures, of history, and I think that with your music and that with my music, that's so central to it. And so I'm so interested. Part of this podcast is about stories and personal journeys and how music both informs and interprets that. And so I'm just so grateful, Dizraeli. I'm just so grateful you've come on and shared your story and shared your music. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks to you, man. It was a really delicious conversation, and I'm really honoured to have heard your story as well,
This podcast is made possible by Making Tracks, a life-changing music-making project delivered by leading youth arts providers Trinity, Basement Studios and ACE, and supported through funding by Youth Music using public funding from the National Lottery through Arts Council England. It's very personal to me because I've been a participant, a volunteer and a tutor. I'm really grateful to everyone who's made this podcast possible. Thank you for listening. I look forward to joining you next time on Making Tracks.